Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. It's so good to see so many people here. Our program this evening, as you know, is Camp Wright at Oakmont.
Tenting tonight, tenting tonight, tenting on the old campground. Tenting tonight, tenting tonight, tenting on the old campground.
Before we talk about Camp Wright here in Oakmont, I think it's important that we talk about Pittsburgh in that time period leading up to the Civil War. Pittsburgh was a very progressive city at the time. It was very anti-slavery, pro-union, and pro-abolitionist. It was also a major stop along the Underground Railroad. A lot of the runaway slaves came up through Virginia into Pittsburgh. And once they were in Pittsburgh, they would be routed a couple of different ways. One of the main routes was down the Ohio River to the Beaver River and then up through Ohio. Another route was out through Indiana County and Armstrong County and out through central Pennsylvania. And then the third route was up the Allegheny River. So we did have runaway slaves, the Underground Railroad, coming up through the Allegheny River Valley here. The other thing that was interesting about Pittsburgh, it had a very prosperous, free African American community. For the time, Pittsburgh was an integrated city back then. There was a community that they called Arthur'sburg, and that was located on the Lower Hill District. And that's where most of the free African Americans lived. One of the leaders here in Pittsburgh was a man by the name of John Vachon. John Vachon owned a barber shop and a bathhouse in Market Square. And all the prominent men of Pittsburgh went there, both African American and white. And so the people mixed, they conducted their business, a lot of deals were made, a lot of gossip was shared at Vachon's. And it was also an important stop on the Underground Railroad, because as the slaves came into Pittsburgh, you know, a lot of them were on the run. They came through the woods, through the forest, they got to Pittsburgh. He would take them into the barber shop and the bathhouse, clean them up, outfit them with new clothes, and then send them on their way. So his establishment was an important part of the Underground Railroad. Another stop on the Underground Railroad was the Monongahela House Hotel. And this was owned by John McDonald Crossan. Now, this was the most luxurious hotel in Pittsburgh. Anybody of importance who came to Pittsburgh during the 1800s stayed at the Monongahela House. It was also a stop on the Underground Railroad. And as slaves came into Pittsburgh, a lot of times they would come into the hotel and Mr. Crossan would hide them there. If the bounty hunters were after them, he would say they were employees, they worked for him at the hotel. And so he protected them that way. And this is just a lithograph of the Monongahela House. It was located on Smithfield Street, and this is when Abraham Lincoln was on his way to his inauguration. He stayed there on his way to Washington, D.C. And this is a picture of him addressing the crowd of Pittsburgh on his way to his inauguration. Now, another gentleman who was an important part of Pittsburgh was a man by the name of Caleb Lee. Caleb Lee was a tailor, and he outfitted all the wealthy men of Pittsburgh. He was the personal tailor of Stephen Foster. So he was very well known, he was very influential in the city of Pittsburgh. It just so happened that in 1848, Caleb Lee purchased 1,000 acres out at Halton Station. And his land extended from the Allegheny River up the hill out past the present-day Oakmont Country Club. So this area had a connection to the prominent men of Pittsburgh. The other connection The owner of the Monongahela House, John McDonald, he had an estate out here, which he called Edgewater. And this is a painting of his estate that was done around 1860 by an artist by the name of Wall. And this would be standing over in Blawnox, that area they call Montrose, looking up the river, and you can see his house there, the bend in the river, the hills on the other side of the Allegheny, and where his mansion and his barn is present-day Edgewater housing development and Edgewater Steel. And that's where the name Edgewater originated, from Mr. Crossan. The other thing that's interesting, it's also said that his house here in Oakmont was also a stop on the Underground Railroad. And that when they came up the Allegheny Valley, they stayed at his house. He had a large stable, you can see that in the back there, and they said he had a wine cellar underneath, and that's where a lot of the runaway slaves. So we had a connection to these prominent people. When I say we, I mean Oakmont, Halton, that they were connected to this area here. Well, we all know April 12th, 1861, rebel forces fired on Fort Sumter, and that was the start of the Civil War. Immediately afterwards, President Lincoln issued a call for 75,000 volunteers to suppress the rebellion. Now, one of the reasons he made the call was because most of the army was out on the western frontier. They were out there, they had some skirmishes, the war with Mexico, protecting the settlers and things like that. So back here in the east, the federal government really didn't have many troops, so they needed people to put down the rebellion. So he put out the call, and men started to sign up. When they signed up for a 3-month term, because most people believed that within 3 months they were going to go down there, they were going to put down the rebellion, straighten them out, and bring them back into the Union. But we all know what happened. In the days leading up to the war, a lot of towns had their own militias. And what they were men from the town who would get together and form a militia. They met usually on Saturdays and Sundays. They practiced marching drills on the town squares or marched in parades. They often had colorful uniforms, and usually the commander or the community would pay for their uniforms. If somebody paid for their uniforms, they might make them the commander. So even though they had no military experience, you got to be the commander. This is a picture of what they called the Zouave cadets out of Chicago. And this is how a lot of them dressed. You can see the baggy pants, the colorful uniforms. Here in western Pennsylvania, we had militias. A few of them were the Warren Guards, the Reed Union Grenadiers, the Franklin Pierce Rifles, the Pittsburgh Rifles, and the Buff Guards. Now, when President Lincoln issued his call, a lot of these militias joined. And when they joined as a unit. So they all went off together to fight together. Now, as I said, they really had no military background, but they were a cohesive unit, and so when they went off to fight together. Well, they issued a call here in Pittsburgh, and the volunteers were instructed to report to duty at Camp Wilkins, which was located in Lawrenceville. Now, this is a painting by an artist, James C. Horton, and he painted this of what Camp Wilkins looked like back then. They had so many people streaming into Camp Wilkins that they had no room for them. So what they had to do was find another location to accommodate all the volunteers that were coming in. Well, on May 29th, Colonel John McLean and Captain Merritt set off with a group of individuals to approve the site of a new camp. They traveled 12 miles out the Allegheny Valley Railroad to the little village of Halton. Upon arriving in Halton, they toured the area and immediately approved the location. And what's interesting, the entourage was welcomed by none other than Caleb Lee. And he had a lot of connection with those people in Pittsburgh. So I would think it would be safe to say that it was Caleb Lee who invited them out here to use his land. And I'm sure they probably paid him to use his land, so I'm sure he probably made some money. But the newspapers reported that they came out, they toured the grounds, they were entertained at the residence of Mrs. Thomas Bell. In the evening, they visited Edgewater, the estate of John Crossan. So they went to Edgewater, they toured the grounds, and they decided that they would establish the new camp out at Halton. Now, this map is hard to see, and I just wanted to give you an idea of where the camp was located. This map is from 1876, and it's an early map, and you can see the rail line coming along there, and then the river is here. The camp was located in that area north of Halton Road between the train tracks and the river. So they started to establish the camp. There was a large orchard that was situated near the train tracks, and there was a large hayfield along the river. So they converted the hayfield into a parade grounds, and there were 2 large springs that they used to supply water for the camp. They named the camp Camp McCall, and that was in honor of Brigadier General John A. McCall. And Colonel John McLean, the commander of the Erie Regiment, was placed in charge of the new camp. We fast forward to the year 1902. This article appeared in the Pittsburgh Daily Post. And Colleen had just sent this to me last week, and so I'm glad I was able to include it in the presentation. But the headline says, "Flames destroy landmark old Lee residence near Halton, which homed Army officers during the Civil War." And it talks about this fire in an old-fashioned log house. And it goes on to describe the fire, but the last paragraph says, "The dwelling was one of the oldest in that section of Allegheny County. Caleb Lee Sr. was the original owner. And during the Civil War, the old farm was used by the soldiers for a drilling ground. And in 1861, the soldiers, in a single day, erected the old barn that still stands today. The barn was used for Army horses, and at the time, the home was the headquarters for the regimental offices." And then it finishes up by saying the present owner is Mrs. George Marshall of Pittsburgh. The exact age of the house is not known, but in 1848, when Caleb Lee purchased it, it had been standing for many years. So that was the house where they had the regimental headquarters. Now, I hope you can see this map. It's a little hard to see. This is a map of 1897 of Halton. And again, you can see the river, you can see the railroad track. I underlined Caleb Lee. There's a little yellow building. And if you look at this map, any yellow building designates a wooden building. If it's red or pink, and it's hard to see them, that means it's a brick building. So we see Caleb Lee and a little yellow building, and behind it is an outbuilding, which looks like a small barn or stable. The interesting thing is, in the article it said that the house in 1902 was owned by Mrs. Marshall. If you look behind, you can see Mrs. Emma L. Marshall owned the property behind. And Colleen did some research and found out that Mrs. Marshall was Caleb Lee's daughter. So from that, we can see where the old Caleb Lee log house was, and which was the headquarters of Camp Wright. Now, looking at that map, I would say that is probably between 5th and Allegheny Avenue. Oakmont, was that Allegheny Avenue over there? Allegheny, on the other side. Up near Lee Street, so Oakmont Avenue, okay, it's Oakmont. So up in that area, and there is another Caleb Lee house there, so I don't know if that's probably on the same property as where the original log house is. What's interesting, you can see this line running down here. That's a spring. That's a little stream coming off the hill, and then up at the end, the borough property is Falling Spring. So they always made reference to two springs which supplied water to the camp, and there's one there and one there. So that's the two springs that supplied water to the camp. When I started to research Camp Wright, I've been researching it now probably, I think it's about 18 years. And it all started, there was an article in the Post-Gazette. A lady in Springdale was researching her family, and one of her ancestors served in the Civil War, and he served at Camp Wright. And she was trying to locate Camp Wright, and she seemed to think it was in Harmerville. And when I read that, I thought, wow, there was a Civil War camp in Harmerville, so close to home. Well, then as it turned out, after research, we found out it wasn't in Harmerville. It was here in Oakmont. We could find no photographs of Camp Wright. However, there were a lot of descriptions of Camp Wright. We were able to find those in a lot of letters that soldiers had written. They talk about the camp. And the Pittsburgh newspapers, I went to the Carnegie Room, and they have all the old newspapers on microfilm. And I started looking through the newspapers, and they must have had reporters out here that sent dispatches back every day, because they told of all the events on a day-by-day basis. So that gave us a good description of the camp. Well, what we did, there's an artist who lived in Oakmont. He's since moved up to New York, Tom McCrady. You may know Tom McCrady. We took all of our newspaper articles, our letters, and old maps. We gave them to Tom, and we asked him if he would sketch out the camp. And so this is his interpretation. And so I know it's hard to see. We brought the enlargement here, which you can take a look at later, but it gives us an idea of what Camp Wright looked like. But the first troops to arrive at Camp Wright were the Warren Guards, and they arrived on June 1st. The first thing they did was they installed water pipes from the springs down into the camp. They began to build barracks, and the barracks were located above the train tracks on the hillside over in that area of Woodlawn Avenue, Lee Street, on the upper side of Halton Road. Each barrack measured 75 feet by 18 feet, and it held 110 soldiers. They were separated by wide streets, and so they began construction on that also on June 1st. They also began construction of the hospital, and the newspaper said that the hospital was located on the lane from the train station to the ferry, halfway down. So that would put it probably right about where Bolte Tire is, in that area there. This hospital, you can see this down in the corner there, there's a picture of it. But they said that the hospital had a center rotunda which measured 26 feet in diameter with 16-foot ceilings. It had 4 wings. It housed a drugstore, a surgeon's quarters, storerooms, kitchens, and dining room. So it was a nice-sized building. The excellent sanitary conditions prevented any serious illnesses, and there were no deaths at Camp Wright from illness. Now on June 5th, just 5 days later, Governor Curtin announced that the camp was to be renamed Camp Wright in honor of Colonel J.A. Wright. Now Colonel Wright was superintendent of the Freedom Iron Works out in Mifflin County. Now he was not a military man, but he was granted the title of colonel for his help with the Civil War. And he was a friend of the governor, so the governor named the camp after him. On June 4th, 200 men arrived from Camp Wilkins. By June 7th, there were 7 extra trains per day running between Pittsburgh and Halton. On June 8th, 15 companies arrived in camp, and 50,000 board feet of lumber were delivered for the buildings. And in addition to the new buildings that they were building, the old Halton, it was new at the time, but the new Halton train station was converted to a commissary. So all the supplies came through the train station. By June 19th, there were 3,000 men at Camp Wright. And by July 1st, the number increased to 4,000. So it rapidly filled up. Now, at the beginning of the talk, we talked about the people of Pittsburgh and how they were so pro-union and patriotic. Well, Camp Wright quickly turned into a tourist attraction. And people from Pittsburgh came out to tour the camp. Some came out on the Allegheny Valley Railroad. Others rode the Pennsylvania Canal out to Harmer and then rode Mr. Halton's ferry across the river. Local merchants set up stands near the camp's entrance, and they began to sell their wares to the visitors and the soldiers. The men could purchase fruits, vegetables, and whiskey. The Pittsburgh Gazette, one of the newspapers at the time, urged its readers to, and this is what they said, visit the camp and take in the beautiful scenery. The cost of the train ticket to Halton is well worth the trip. And what they would do, the newspapers would print the parade times. A group of ladies from Pittsburgh donated flags to the regiments, and they were invited guests of honor for the evening parades. On June 11th, 75 ladies from Apollo chartered a canal boat on the Pennsylvania Canal, and they brought cakes, pies, butters, and fruit to the soldiers of the Apollo Independent Rifles from Armstrong County. And they had a picnic for them in the picnic grove above the camp. Women from Blairsville presented each member of the Indiana County Guards with a Bible before they went off to fight. And so each train that came into Halton, in addition to military supplies, brought packages from home. They were always people were sending things to their sons, their fathers, brothers that were training at Camp Wright. The patriotism and celebration reached a high point on July 4th, 1861. Visitors began arriving early in the morning, and the festivities began with a 34-gun salute, which was led by the Erie Regiment. In the afternoon, the soldiers enjoyed a picnic in the groves adjacent to the camp. And at 4 p.m., all the troops gathered on the parade grounds, and the Declaration of Independence was read by Lieutenant Colonel Grant of the Erie Regiment. After that, Captain Potter of the Indiana Guards gave a speech, and then there was a review of all the troops. There was a flag-raising ceremony at the home of Isabella Greer. Now, some of you may know the Greer house is still on Isabella Street, so that house was there. But they went over there and had a flag-raising ceremony. At the end of the day, the crowd was entertained by the Erie Regiment Band. They sang patriotic songs. And the Pittsburgh Gazette reported that soldiers and guests numbered 10,000 that day here at Camp Wright. So people were always coming out here. The celebration continued after July 4th. On July 10th, they had a flagpole that they raised. And they said that this flagpole was over 100 feet tall. And they put that up in the camp. They raised a flag, and the band played the Star Spangled Banner and Yankee Doodle. A Confederate flag was captured at the Battle of Philippi in today West Virginia, but then Virginia. And they sent the Confederate flag back to Camp Wright, and it was hung upside down above the barracks of the Armstrong Rifles. So along with this deep feeling of patriotism, there was also strong religious beliefs with the soldiers. And so a lot of the pastors from their hometown would come to Camp Wright and hold services. On July 26th, there was a Reverend Kennedy from Indiana, PA, a Reverend Boyle from Mount Jackson, and Reverend Pratt from Johnstown. All came to the camp and held services for the soldiers. On July 15th, 2,200 guns finally arrived at Camp Wright. They had no guns up until that time. They would practice their drills with sticks or small logs, or if some of them brought guns from home, that's what they used. By the end of July, there were over 4,000 troops at Camp Wright. Colonel McLean had received a complaint from the local farmers in Halton saying that the troops were stealing his vegetables and scaring his sow. So Colonel McLean said, stay in the camp, don't go out there and cause trouble. One night in July, there was a local saloon here in the area, and there was a group of men who came out from Pittsburgh. And some of the soldiers from Camp Wright had snuck over there, and a fight erupted. And they said the furniture was smashed, the bar room was just destroyed. It's similar to, we see one of those bar fights in an Old West movie. That's what it was. Well, Colonel Grant called out 3 regiments to go up and put down the disturbance, stop the riot. So the soldiers charged up Halton Road, across the train tracks, and into the bar. Well, they dispersed it, and there was a gentleman by the name of Oliver Wilcox Norton, and he was from the Erie Regiment. And he said, he wrote in a letter that during the riot, he told one of the guys to stand down, and he wouldn't, so he jabbed him with his bayonet. And he said that the soldier was so mad at him, he searched for him for 3 days throughout Camp Wright, because he said if he found him, he would shoot him. So they had trouble with people liking to drink their whiskey with a group of men, but I guess that happens anywhere. But what's interesting, on July 9th, a spy was arrested at Camp Wright. There were a lot of people that came in to visit, and they noticed that this one man was hanging around. He was at the camp for a couple of days. The other thing that caught their attention, it was the middle of July, but he was wearing a coat. And so they finally approached him. They found out that he had 3 revolvers and a pound of arsenic in his coat. And his plan was he was going to dump the arsenic into the wells and poison the troops. But what he didn't know, there were no wells at Camp Wright. The water was supplied by springs. So needless to say, he was apprehended, and don't know what happened to him, but they took him off somewhere. So the Allegheny River provided a refreshing diversion for the troops during their free time. They said that during their free time they would go to the river, they would swim in the river, they would write letters under the shade trees, and they said that they would also tour the glass house at Halton. So that was a key, that we knew there was a glass works in Halton, but we didn't know it was there during the Civil War, and it did go back that far. And if you look at Tom's picture, up near the top, he did include the glass works up there. In a letter to his father on June 22nd, 1861, one of the troops named Oliver Wilcox Norton wrote, "I am in the river every day. The river is about 100 rods wide here with a swift current. I rolled up my blanket the other night and slept under an apple tree. I slept first rate. Did not wake till reveille, nor take the least cold. Some boys are getting copper-colored in the hot sun. The weather is warm and dry." And they also said, some of the soldiers collected mussels from the river and made rings, and that they also toured the glass house at Halton. What's interesting is almost every account of Camp Wright talks about how beautiful it was, how scenic it was. And newspapers, letters, they all referred to how scenic the camp was and what a nice place it was. So it's unfortunate that, the camp was a nice place, but then what the soldiers were all headed to, the Civil War and the death and the suffering that they would go through in the war. And as I said, over 4,000 men passed through Camp Wright, and there were a few notable men who served at Camp Wright. The first was Oliver Wilcox Norton. He was from the Erie Regiment, and he was the first bugler in the Army to play taps. If you're familiar with General Dan Butterfield, was the composer of taps, and he served under Butterfield. So it was Norton who was the first person to play taps for the Army. This is Colonel John McClain. He was the organizer of the Erie Regiment, and he was named commander of Camp Wright. After the Erie Regiment was dissolved, he returned home to Erie County, and he formed the 83rd Pennsylvania Reserves. He was killed at the Battle of Gaines Mills, and upon his death, he was promoted to general. And so he's from up in that Erie County area, and he has a school district named after him. Up in Edinburgh, PA, they have General McClain School District. Another one was Colonel Strong Vincent. He was a commander at Camp Wright, and he died at the Battle of Little Round Top at Gettysburg. And again, when I went to college in Edinburgh, Erie had a high school called Erie Strong Vincent. And I never knew what that meant, and it is named after him. And this is a statue of Strong Vincent. Another person that served at Camp Wright was a young soldier by the name of Adam Bright. And in July of 1861, he wrote to his brother David, "We're encamped about 3 miles from Washington. We have a very nice, healthy camp, but it is no Camp Wright." What's interesting, Adam Bright's grandfather is Michael Bright, who was the original settler here in Oakmont. So he was a hometown boy that served at Camp Wright before he went off to fight in the war. And this is another letter that describes the camp. And again, this is from Oliver Wilcox Norton. He had a book that was written entitled Army Letters 1861 to 1865. And so it's a compilation of all his letters he wrote home, and there's some nice description of Camp Wright. But he wrote to his sister, and he said, "Dear sister, I wish you could just step in and see us here, say on dress parade. We are in just a beautiful place as I ever saw. The lovely Allegheny rolls along at the foot of the hill, and the little country seats nestled in the quiet nooks. The new buildings in camp, the groves and orchard, the lane that leads to the river, and the beautiful mountain rising up on the other side of the river make a picture I never saw equaled." So they were all impressed with Camp Wright and just the beautiful scenery around it. In January of 1862, only 9 months after it opened, Camp Wright closed. The buildings were torn down, the materials were sold off at auction, and the camp was lost to history as the tragic events of the Civil War overshadowed any fond memories of Camp Wright. So once the soldiers, the volunteers, had went off to fight, they met their quotas, and the camp was closed down. So it was in existence less than a year. As I said, we have that sketch there. We do have those for sale if anybody's interested. We have the watercolor and we have the black and white. There's only 100 of them. Each one is signed and numbered by Tom McCrady. So anybody that would want one, we do have those available for sale. So it was in existence 9 months. And again, no pictures that we know of. Not really anything left of Camp Wright. It was in existence less than a year. Our historical society, we are going to try to get one of those blue historical markers and put it down near the Halton Bridge, designating Camp Wright. We want to wait till all that bridge construction's finished, and we're going to apply for it, and hopefully we'll be able to get one of those markers put down there. All right, well, I thank you for coming out.
On the old campground, give us a song to cheer our weary hearts, a song of home and friends we love so dear. Many are the hearts that are weary tonight, wishing for the war to cease. Many are the hearts looking for the Wright to see the dawn of peace. Tenting tonight, tenting tonight, tenting on the old campground. Tenting tonight, tenting tonight, tenting on the old campground.